The haunting wail of a grieving mother echoed through the desolate hills of Georgetown, Colorado, piercing the crisp mountain air of 1876 like a knife. Elizabeth Vaughn clutched the small, still bundle wrapped in a hand-stitched quilt to her chest, her tears falling onto the fabric that should have swaddled her living, breathing child. Instead, it served as a shroud for dreams that would never come to pass. The graveyard sat on a gentle slope overlooking the mining town, dotted with wooden crosses and the occasional stone marker of those whose families could afford such luxury. Elizabeth had chosen a spot beneath a young aspen tree, its leaves trembling in the breeze as if sharing in her sorrow. She had come alone, unable to bear the pitying looks and awkward condolences of neighbors who couldn't possibly understand the depth of her loss. Her husband James had been gone for months, chasing silver dreams in the mountains further west. He didn't even know their child had been born and died all while he was away. The letter she'd sent weeks ago when her time grew near would have missed him entirely, given his wandering ways. Elizabeth had faced childbirth alone and now faced grief the same way, or so she thought. "Madam." The voice was gentle, tinged with a southern drawl that seemed out of place in the Colorado Rockies. "I don't mean to intrude." Elizabeth didn't look up, couldn't bear to tear her eyes away from the small grave where the caretaker had helped her dig earlier that morning. "Please leave me be," she whispered, her voice raw from hours of weeping. Instead of retreating footsteps, she heard a soft thud as the stranger knelt in the dirt beside her. From the corner of her eye, she caught sight of worn leather boots and denim-clad legs. A cowboy, by the look of him. "My name's Matthew Parker," he said quietly. "I know words don't mean much right now, but I'm mighty sorry for your loss." The sincerity in his voice finally made Elizabeth turn her head. The man beside her wasn't looking at her with pity as she'd feared. His eyes a deep brown that reminded her of fertile soil after rain held something else entirely. Understanding, recognition, the look of someone who knew this particular pain. "Did you?" she began, unable to finish the question. Matthew nodded, removing his hat and holding it against his chest. "My wife and our baby boy, 2 years ago in Montana." He spoke simply, without drama or demand for sympathy. A statement of fact that carried the weight of mountains. For the first time since labor had begun 3 days prior, Elizabeth felt something other than crushing grief. A strange kinship with this stranger who truly knew what it meant to hold a child that never drew breath. "Elizabeth Vaughn," she offered, her voice barely audible above the rustling aspen leaves. Matthew didn't try to fill the silence with empty reassurances or religious platitudes. Instead, he simply reached out a sun-weathered hand and laid it palm up on his knee, an offer, not a demand. After a moment's hesitation, Elizabeth placed her trembling hand in his. His fingers closed around hers gently, their shared grief creating a connection neither had expected to find on this hillside. They remained that way as the afternoon sun began its descent behind the mountains, casting long shadows across the small, fresh grave of the daughter Elizabeth had named Rose, though the name would never be called in a schoolyard or whispered in bedtime stories. "I won't tell you it gets easier," Matthew finally said, his voice rough with emotion, "but somehow we keep breathing." Elizabeth nodded, feeling the truth of his words settle in her chest alongside her grief. "Somehow," she echoed. As twilight gathered around them, Matthew helped her to her feet. The night air carried the first bite of autumn, and Elizabeth pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "You have somewhere to stay in town?" Matthew asked, concern evident in his features as he noticed her shiver. "I have a small house near the milliner's shop I take in sewing." Elizabeth looked down at her daughter's grave one last time. "I should get back. There's nothing more I can do here." Matthew nodded, replacing his hat. "Would you allow me to walk you home, Mrs. Vaughn? These paths can be treacherous after dark." Under normal circumstances, Elizabeth might have declined. A proper widow didn't accept escorts from strange men. But these weren't normal circumstances, and something about Matthew Parker's quiet dignity made her nod in acceptance. They walked down the hill in silence, the lights of Georgetown glowing softly in the valley below. The town had grown considerably since the silver boom began, with wooden storefronts lining the main street and saloons doing brisk business from morning until well past midnight. As they approached her modest home on a side street away from the noisier establishments, Elizabeth found herself reluctant to end this unexpected connection. "Mr. Parker," she said, stopping at her gate, "I don't know how to thank you for your kindness today." Matthew shook his head. "No thanks needed, Mrs. Vaughn. No one should bear such grief alone." He hesitated, then added, "I'm staying at the Western Hotel for a few days before heading south. If you need anything at all, you just send word." Elizabeth nodded, knowing she wouldn't impose but appreciating the genuine offer. "How did you come to be at the cemetery today?" she asked, realizing she hadn't wondered about this earlier. A sad smile crossed Matthew's face. "I make it a point to visit local graveyards whenever I'm in a new town. To pay respects to the little ones. It helps me feel." He trailed off, searching for words. "Less alone," Elizabeth finished for him. Their eyes met in the dim light spilling from her front window, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition that went beyond words. "Good night, Mrs. Vaughn," Matthew said softly, tipping his hat. "Good night, Mr. Parker," she replied, watching as he turned and walked back toward the main street, his tall figure gradually disappearing into the darkness. Inside her small house, Elizabeth moved through her evening routine by rote stoking the fire, heating water for tea, turning down the bed she'd prepared so carefully for her homecoming with a baby that would never sleep there. The emptiness of the house seemed to mock her preparations, the small cradle in the corner, the neatly folded baby clothes in the chest, the rocking chair positioned perfectly by the fire. She sat at her kitchen table, a cup of untouched tea growing cold before her, and wondered how she would face the coming days. James was unlikely to return anytime soon, perhaps not even by winter. His last letter had spoken of promising claims further west, his handwriting betraying his excitement at the prospect of striking it rich. Elizabeth had stopped sharing his optimism months ago, when the money he sent dwindled to occasional small sums that barely covered necessities. Her hands drifted to her still swollen belly, a cruel reminder of what should have been. The midwife had warned her that her body would take time to return to normal, but Elizabeth wondered if anything would ever feel normal again. Sleep evaded her that night, as it had since labor began. When she did drift off near dawn, her dreams were filled with infant cries that jerked her awake, heart pounding, only to find the house as silent as a tomb. Morning brought a knock at her door. Elizabeth, who had been sitting motionless in the rocking chair since before sunrise, startled at the sound. She smoothed her rumpled dress, the same one she'd worn yesterday, and opened the door to find Matthew Parker standing on her porch, hat in hand, holding a small basket. "Mrs. Vaughn," he greeted her, his eyes taking in her exhausted appearance. "I hope I'm not intruding, but I thought you might appreciate some breakfast." He lifted the basket slightly. "The hotel cook owed me a favor." The kindness of the gesture nearly undid her composure. Elizabeth blinked rapidly, fighting back tears. "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Parker. Would you?" She hesitated, aware of how improper it would seem to invite him in, yet unable to send him away. "Would you care to join me?" If Matthew recognized the social breach, he gave no indication. He simply nodded and followed her inside, placing the basket on the kitchen table and carefully averting his eyes from the cradle in the corner. The basket contained still warm biscuits, a jar of preserves, and some ham wrapped in waxed paper. Simple fare, but the most appetizing food Elizabeth had seen in days. She found herself actually hungry for the first time since losing Rose. As they ate, Matthew spoke of inconsequential things: the weather, the town's growth since his last visit through the area 2 years prior, the quality of the hotel's accommodations. He carefully avoided any mention of her loss or his own, giving her a respite from grief that felt like drawing a full breath after being underwater. "What brings you to Georgetown, Mr. Parker?" Elizabeth asked, finding comfort in normal conversation. Matthew wiped his mouth with a napkin before answering. "I'm delivering horses to ranches south of here. Got a small breeding operation near Denver. Nothing fancy, but the horses are sound and well-trained." "You're a horse breeder?" Elizabeth found herself genuinely interested, picturing this quiet man working with the powerful animals. "Among other things," Matthew nodded. "Worked cattle for years in Texas before that. Tried my hand at mining for a spell too, but found I prefer the company of horses to most men." A wry smile touched his lips. "They're more honest about their intentions." Elizabeth found herself smiling in return, a small, fragile thing, but a smile nonetheless. It felt foreign on her face after so many days of tears. "And you, Mrs. Vaughn, have you been in Georgetown long?" Matthew asked, his tone conversational but his eyes attentive. "Almost 2 years now. My husband James came for the silver rush. He works various claims." She didn't mention how infrequently he returned home, or how his initial success had given way to a series of disappointments that sent him searching farther afield with each passing month. Matthew seemed to hear what she didn't say. "Mining's a hard life. Takes a man away from what's important too often." The observation held no judgment, just understanding. "Yes," Elizabeth agreed softly. "It does." After breakfast, Matthew helped clear the dishes despite her protests. As he prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Mrs. Vaughn, I'll be in town for 2 more days settling some business. Would it be presumptuous to call on you again?" His expression was earnest, with no hint of ulterior motive beyond genuine concern. Elizabeth knew she should refuse. Propriety demanded it. But the thought of facing another day alone with her grief made her answer before prudence could intervene. "I would welcome your company, Mr. Parker." He tipped his hat. "Until tomorrow, then." After he left, Elizabeth moved to the window and watched him walk down the street, his posture straight but unhurried. For the first time since the midwife had placed her stillborn daughter in her arms with a sympathetic shake of her head, Elizabeth felt a small spark of something other than despair. Not hope, it was too soon for that, but perhaps the barest acknowledgement that the world continued to turn despite her loss. Later that afternoon, she found herself at her sewing table, mechanically completing the mending Mrs. Hollister had brought by weeks ago. The familiar rhythm of needle through fabric provided a meditative quality that allowed her mind to drift. She thought of Matthew Parker's gentle presence at the cemetery, the warmth of his hand holding hers, the understanding in his eyes that came from walking a similar path of loss. That evening, for the first time since Rose's birth and death, Elizabeth forced herself to bathe properly and change into fresh clothes. She even attempted to tame her auburn hair, which had become a tangled mess during her confinement and subsequent grief. The simple acts of self-care didn't diminish her sorrow, but they made her feel more human, less like a ghost haunting her own life. True to his word, Matthew returned the following morning. This time, He brought no food, but instead a small potted plant, an alpine flower with delicate blue blossoms. The lady at the mercantile said these are hardy enough to survive indoors through winter if given enough light, he explained somewhat self-consciously as he handed it to her. Thought your home could use something living. The gesture touched Elizabeth deeply. Not just the gift itself, but the thought behind it, an acknowledgement of her need to nurture something after having lost her child. It's beautiful, she said, placing it carefully on the windowsill where the morning sun would reach it. Thank you. Matthew removed his hat as he entered, revealing dark hair with just a touch of silver at the temples. Elizabeth guessed him to be in his mid-30s, perhaps 5 or 6 years older than herself. Lines at the corners of his eyes spoke of both laughter and hardship. I thought, if you're feeling up to it, a short walk might do you good, Matthew suggested. The air's crisp today, but the sun's warming things nicely. Elizabeth hesitated. She hadn't ventured beyond her property except to visit Rose's grave since the birth. The thought of encountering neighbors, of fielding their questions or sympathy, made her stomach clench with anxiety. Matthew seemed to read her concerns. We could take the path along the creek, he offered. Not many folks head that way this time of morning. The thoughtfulness of his suggestion decided her. I would like that. Let me get my shawl. The creek path wound away from town, following the clear mountain stream through stands of aspen and pine. The trees were beginning to show the first hints of autumn gold, and the water gurgled pleasantly over smooth stones. They walked slowly, with Matthew shortening his naturally long stride to match Elizabeth's more tentative pace. I used to walk here often when I first arrived, Elizabeth said, breaking a comfortable silence. Before your condition made it difficult, Matthew finished for her when she trailed off. Elizabeth nodded, grateful for his straightforward acknowledgement rather than awkward avoidance of her pregnancy and loss. Tell me about Denver, she said, changing the subject. I've never been, though it's not so very far. Matthew described the growing city with its mix of refined establishments and frontier roughness. His observations were detailed and sometimes humorous, painting a picture of a place striving for sophistication while still muddy at its edges. My ranch is northeast of the city, he continued. Small spread compared to what you'd find in Texas, but good pasture and water. Enough for my breeding stock and a few cattle for my own use. You live there alone? Elizabeth asked, then immediately wished she could retract the overly personal question. If Matthew found it improper, he gave no indication. I have a hand who helps with the horses, Felipe, a Mexican fella who's forgotten more about horseflesh than most will ever learn, and a housekeeper who comes by twice weekly to ensure I don't live entirely like a savage. His smile held a touch of self-deprecation. But yes, otherwise I'm on my own since losing Margaret. The mention of his wife's name hung in the air between them. Elizabeth found herself wanting to know more but hesitant to press. Matthew seemed to understand her unspoken curiosity. She was from Boston originally. Came west as a schoolteacher. I met her in Cheyenne while delivering horses to the army. Courted her for 6 months before she agreed to marry me. His expression softened at the memory. She was the smartest person I ever knew, made me want to be better than I was. How long were you married? Elizabeth asked softly. 3 years. The best 3 years of my life. Matthew looked out over the creek, his profile strong against the backdrop of golden aspens. She died bringing our son into the world, neither survived the birth. Elizabeth felt tears welling in her eyes, not just for her own loss now, but for his. I'm sorry. Matthew turned back to her, his expression gentle. As am I for your loss, Mrs. Vaughn, but I've found that sharing grief makes it a fraction more bearable, at least for moments at a time. They continued walking, their conversation drifting to lighter topics. Elizabeth found herself sharing stories of her childhood in Missouri, of her skill with a needle that had won her praise from the town's finest ladies, of her dreams of one day opening a dress shop of her own. "Why haven't you?" Matthew asked. "Opened a shop, I mean. Your talent is evident." He gestured to the fine stitching on her shawl, which she had embroidered herself. Elizabeth sighed. "James believes a woman's place is in the home. He sees my sewing as a suitable pastime but not a proper business." She shrugged slightly. "And truthfully, we've never had the money to invest in such a venture. Mining is expensive, and James is convinced the next big strike is always just around the corner." Matthew made a noncommittal sound that somehow conveyed both understanding and a certain skepticism, without being outright disrespectful of her husband. They reached a small clearing where a fallen log provided a natural bench overlooking a wider portion of the creek. Matthew gestured toward it. "Shall we rest a moment? I don't want to tire you." Elizabeth nodded, realizing she was indeed feeling fatigued. Her body was still recovering, a fact she'd momentarily forgotten in the pleasure of conversation and fresh air. As they sat, a comfortable silence fell between them. Elizabeth found herself studying Matthew's hands, strong and capable, with calluses that spoke of honest work, yet gentle when they had held hers at the gravesite. "Will you return to Denver tomorrow?" she asked, suddenly aware that their unexpected connection had a definite endpoint. Matthew nodded, his expression regretful. "I need to deliver the horses to the Burwell Ranch by week's end. It's a 2-day ride from here in good weather." "Of course," Elizabeth said, trying to mask her disappointment. "You've been exceedingly kind to a stranger, Mr. Parker." "I won't soon forget it." "Matthew," he said quietly. "Please call me Matthew, at least when it's just the two of us." The request was improper by strict social standards, but Elizabeth found herself nodding. "Then you must call me Elizabeth." The use of first names shifted something between them, an acknowledgement that, whatever this connection was, it had moved beyond mere politeness or charitable concern. As they walked back toward town, Elizabeth found herself wishing the path were longer, that this respite from solitude could stretch just a little further. At her gate, they paused. "Would it be presumptuous of me to write to you, Elizabeth?" Matthew asked, his expression serious. "Not with any improper intent, but simply as a friend who understands something of what you're experiencing." Elizabeth knew she should refuse. A married woman accepting correspondence from a man not her husband invited gossip at best, scandal at worst. But the thought of returning to complete isolation after these brief days of connection was suddenly unbearable. "I would welcome your letters," she said quietly. "As a friend." Matthew's smile was warm but respectful. "Thank you. I'll call once more before I leave tomorrow, if I may." Elizabeth nodded, watching as he tipped his hat and turned to go. She remained at her gate long after he'd disappeared from view, wondering at the strange turns life could take, how in the depths of her greatest sorrow she had found an unexpected kindred spirit. That night, Elizabeth slept better than she had since Rose's birth. Her grief didn't lessen, but somehow knowing she wasn't entirely alone in it made it marginally more bearable. The following morning, she found herself taking extra care with her appearance. She chose a dark blue dress that complemented her eyes, and pinned her hair more carefully than she had in months. Looking in her small mirror, Elizabeth hardly recognized herself. Grief had hollowed her cheeks and left shadows beneath her eyes, but there was a spark of something not quite life, but perhaps the potential for it that hadn't been there days before. Matthew's knock came precisely at 10 o'clock. When Elizabeth opened the door, she found him similarly tidied, his dark hair neatly combed, his shirt clean and pressed beneath a well-worn but quality leather vest. "Good morning," he said, a smile warming his features. "I thought perhaps you might accompany me to visit Rose before I depart." The thoughtful suggestion brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes, but they weren't solely tears of grief this time. "I would like that very much." They walked to the cemetery in companionable silence, Matthew shortening his stride to match hers. The morning was clear and cool, with the aspens shimmering in a gentle breeze. At the small grave, Elizabeth knelt and arranged the wildflowers she had gathered along the way. Matthew stood respectfully nearby, hat in hand, his expression solemn but comforting. "Would you like a moment alone?" he asked after she had straightened. Elizabeth surprised herself by shaking her head. "No, I'd like you to stay." They stood side by side, the small mound of earth between them and the vast Colorado sky above. Elizabeth felt Matthew's solid presence beside her like an anchor in a storm-tossed sea. "I believe they know," Matthew said quietly. "Somehow, wherever they are, they know they were loved." Elizabeth nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. After a moment, she reached for his hand and he took it, his warm fingers enfolding hers. As they walked back toward town, Elizabeth gathered her courage. "Will you be coming through Georgetown again?" Matthew looked at her, his expression serious. "I wasn't planning to, but plans can change." "I would understand if they didn't," Elizabeth said quickly. "You've been kinder than I had any right to expect, and Elizabeth," Matthew interrupted gently, "I find myself reluctant to say goodbye. If you would welcome another visit, I could arrange to return in a few weeks' time when business takes me this direction again." The relief that flooded her was startling in its intensity. "I would welcome it very much." They had reached her home and Matthew stopped at the gate. "I'll write when I return to Denver," he promised, "and I'll look forward to your reply." Elizabeth nodded, suddenly finding it difficult to meet his eyes. "Safe travels, Matthew," he tipped his hat. "Until we meet again, Elizabeth." She watched him walk away, his tall figure striding purposefully toward the livery where his horses waited. Only when he had turned the corner and disappeared from view did she enter her house, feeling both bereft at his departure and strangely hopeful at the prospect of his return. The days that followed settled into a rhythm of grief that was different from before. Elizabeth still visited Rose's grave daily, still wept for the daughter she would never know, still felt the aching emptiness in her arms that should have held a child. But alongside these sorrows, she found herself able to resume her sewing work, to exchange pleasantries with neighbors, to notice the changing colors of the aspens as autumn deepened. A letter arrived from James 2 weeks after Rose's birth and death. It was brief, filled with tales of promising claims and potential investors, with only a cursory inquiry about her health and no mention of the expected child. Elizabeth realized he likely hadn't received her earlier letter informing him of her condition. She sat at her kitchen table for hours, quill in hand, trying to find words to tell him of their daughter's death. In the end, her letter was as brief as his yes, she was well. Yes, the money he'd sent was sufficient a lie. And yes, she had given birth to a daughter who had not survived. She signed it simply, "Your wife, Elizabeth," and posted it the next day, knowing it might be months before it reached him, if ever. Matthew's letter arrived 3 weeks after his departure, delivered by the stagecoach that passed through Georgetown twice weekly. Elizabeth's hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal, aware of the postmistress's curious gaze, but beyond caring about town gossip. His handwriting was surprisingly elegant for a man who worked with horses and cattle, clear, flowing script that spoke of a decent education. The letter itself was respectful but warm, inquiring after her health and spirits, describing his journey back to Denver and the daily operations of his ranch. He wrote of a foal born the previous week, of the changing seasons on the plains, of books he was reading in the evening hours. Between the lines, Elizabeth read his genuine concern and interest. This wasn't mere politeness or charity. Matthew Parker cared about her well-being in a way few people in her life ever had. She wrote back that same evening, her letter similarly proper in content, but infused with a warmth she hadn't expressed to anyone in years. She told him of the turning aspens, of the new dress she was sewing for Mrs. Hollister's daughter, of the small improvements she'd made to her home. She didn't mention James, or the emptiness that still yawned within her, but somehow felt certain Matthew would understand what remained unwritten. Their correspondence continued through October and into November. Matthew wrote of his plans to travel to Georgetown in early December to deliver a pair of horses to a mine owner in the area. Elizabeth found herself counting the days until his arrival with an anticipation that both excited and unsettled her. She was a married woman, after all, and while there had been nothing improper in their interactions, she couldn't deny the connection between them had grown beyond ordinary friendship. The first snow fell in late November, transforming Georgetown into a wonderland of white-capped buildings and glistening streets. Elizabeth added extra quilts to her bed and kept the fire burning day and night against the mountain chill. She thought often of James, wondering if he had adequate shelter wherever his quest for silver had taken him, if he had received her letter about Rose, if he ever thought of returning home. 3 days before Matthew's expected arrival, another letter came from James. It was the shortest, yet barely a paragraph explaining that he had joined a group, heading into Utah territory, where rumors of rich deposits had drawn prospectors from across the West. He enclosed a small sum of money that wouldn't cover a month's expenses and asked her to keep hearth and home until his return in spring. No mention of their daughter, no acknowledgement of Elizabeth's grief, no true consideration of her needs. Elizabeth read the letter twice, then set it aside with a strange sense of detachment. There had been a time when James's extended absences had left her devastated, when his promises of imminent success had buoyed her hopes. Now she felt only a dull resignation. Their marriage had become a fiction maintained through occasional letters and increasingly rare visits. When Matthew arrived in Georgetown on the promised day, Elizabeth was waiting. She had taken special care with her appearance, wearing a forest green dress that brought out the auburn highlights in her hair, which she had arranged more elaborately than her usual simple style. The dark mourning clothes she had worn since Rose's death remained in her wardrobe, not forgotten, but set aside for this day. They met at the small restaurant attached to the Western Hotel, a public setting that preserved propriety while allowing them to converse. Matthew stood when she entered, his face lighting with a smile that warmed her more effectively than the blazing fire in the restaurant's hearth. "Elizabeth," he said, taking her gloved hand briefly in greeting, "you look well." "As do you, Matthew," she replied, noting how his presence seemed to fill the room despite his quiet demeanor. Over a meal of venison stew and fresh bread, they moved beyond the constraints of their letters to speak more freely. Matthew told her of his journey, of the horses he had brought for Mr. Sutton at the Silver Strike mine, of his plans for expanding his breeding program in the coming year. "And you?" he asked, his eyes attentive. "How have these weeks been for you?" Elizabeth considered the question seriously. "Different," she finally said. "The grief doesn't leave, but it changes. Some days I can almost breathe normally, other days." She trailed off, but Matthew nodded in understanding. "It comes in waves," he said quietly. "Even now, 2 years later, something will remind me of Margaret or our son, and it's like losing them anew." Their conversation flowed easily from there, touching on books they'd both read, on the changing politics back east that seemed so distant from their mountain lives, on the simple pleasures of their respective days. Elizabeth found herself laughing at Matthew's dry observations about Denver society, surprising herself with the unfamiliar sound. As their meal concluded, Matthew hesitated before speaking. "I'll be in town for 3 days," he said. "Mr. Sutton has asked me to look at some other horses he's considering purchasing. I was hoping," he paused, choosing his words carefully. "I was hoping we might spend some time together while I'm here." Elizabeth knew what propriety demanded that she limit their interaction to perhaps one more public meeting, that she maintain the distance expected between a married woman and a man not her husband. But propriety had brought her little comfort in her grief, while Matthew's friendship had been a lifeline. "I would like that very much," she said. "Perhaps a walk tomorrow if the weather permits." Matthew's smile was worth whatever gossip might result. "I'll call for you at 10, if that's agreeable." The 3 days of Matthew's stay in Georgetown passed too quickly for Elizabeth's liking. They walked along snow-covered paths, visited Rose's grave together, and shared meals at the restaurant where the owner, Mrs. Daniels, watched them with curious but not unkind eyes. On the final evening, Matthew escorted Elizabeth home after dinner, their breath forming clouds in the frigid December air. At her gate, they paused, both reluctant to end their time together. The moon hung low and full over the mountains, casting enough light to illuminate Matthew's features as he looked down at her. "I've treasured these days, Elizabeth," he said, his voice low. "More than I can properly express." Elizabeth felt a warmth spreading through her despite the cold. "As have I." Matthew took a deep breath. "I'm not sure when business will bring me back to Georgetown, but I'd like to continue our correspondence if you're willing." "Of course," Elizabeth said quickly, then added more softly, "Your letters have meant a great deal to me." Matthew nodded, his expression serious. "Elizabeth, I want to be clear about something. I respect your marriage and would never ask you to compromise your principles. But I would be less than honest if I didn't acknowledge that my feelings for you have grown beyond simple friendship." The confession hung in the air between them, both frightening and exhilarating in its implications. Elizabeth knew she should step away, should thank him politely but firmly for his friendship and nothing more. Instead, she found herself saying, "I feel the same, Matthew. And I don't know what to do about it." Relief and something deeper flashed in his eyes. "We don't need to do anything right now except acknowledge the truth of it. I won't press you, Elizabeth. I just couldn't leave without you knowing." She nodded, grateful for his understanding. "Write to me." "At every opportunity," he promised. As he turned to go, Elizabeth called after him. "Matthew, thank you for sitting with me that day, at the cemetery. I don't think I ever properly thanked you." Matthew's smile held both joy and sadness. Some burdens weren't meant to be carried alone. Winter settled fully over Georgetown in the weeks following Matthew's departure. Snow piled high against buildings, and the mountain passes became treacherous if not impassable. Elizabeth maintained her routine, sewing by the fire during daylight hours, reading by lamplight in the evenings, visiting Rose's snow-covered grave when weather permitted. But now, each day also held the anticipation of Matthew's letters, which arrived with surprising regularity despite the challenging winter conditions. Their correspondence deepened as the season progressed. Matthew wrote of his childhood in Virginia, of losing his parents young, and being raised by an uncle who taught him horsemanship and integrity in equal measure. Elizabeth shared stories of her own upbringing, a merchant's daughter in Missouri, with aspirations beyond her station. Her meeting with James when he came through town with tales of Western adventure and opportunity. In February, A particularly heavy snowstorm isolated Georgetown for nearly a week. When the stagecoach finally made it through, it brought a package from Matthew alongside his usual letter. Inside the carefully wrapped parcel, Elizabeth found a leather-bound copy of Tennyson's poems, a luxury she would never have purchased for herself, with a simple inscription. For Elizabeth. Words when mine fail. Matthew. She held the book to her chest, tears pricking at her eyes. The gift represented more than literary appreciation. It was an acknowledgement of her intellect, her sensitivity, her personhood beyond being a wife or a mother. It was the most thoughtful present she had received in years. As winter yielded reluctantly to spring, Elizabeth found herself changing in subtle ways. She began taking more care with her appearance, not just on days when letters might arrive. She started planting a small garden in the patch of earth behind her house. She considered seriously, for the first time, the possibility of opening the dress shop she had long dreamed of, perhaps renting the vacant space next to the mercantile. She was contemplating this very thing one April morning when a knock came at her door. Expecting Mrs. Hollister with more mending, Elizabeth was startled to find her husband standing on the threshold, looking trail worn and considerably thinner than when she'd last seen him. "James," she gasped, stepping back involuntarily. "Elizabeth," he nodded, removing his hat as he entered the house without waiting for an invitation. His eyes scanned the small space, registering the cradle still in the corner. "I got your letter. About the baby." Elizabeth's heart constricted at his casual reference to the child she had carried and lost. "Her name was Rose," she said quietly but firmly. James nodded absently, dropping his saddlebags on the floor and moving to warm his hands by the fire. "Unfortunate business, that. But perhaps it's for the best. Life's hard enough out here without a squalling infant." The callousness of his response stunned Elizabeth into momentary silence. When she found her voice, it was steady despite her inner turmoil. "Rose was our daughter, James, not an unfortunate business. She deserved to be mourned properly." James turned to her, his expression softening slightly. "Course she did, Lizzie. I'm just saying maybe it's God's will. We can try again when I'm more settled." Elizabeth stared at the man she had married 5 years earlier, trying to reconcile him with the stranger before her now. The handsome, ambitious man who had swept her off her feet with promises of adventure and prosperity had become gaunt and restless, his eyes holding a feverish gleam she recognized from other miners who couldn't give up the dream of the next big strike. "Are you back to stay?" she asked, already knowing the answer. James shook his head. "Just passing through. Met a fellow in Green River with solid information about a new vein near Telluride. Going to head that way come morning. Need to restock supplies first." Elizabeth nodded, unsurprised. "You look thin. Let me make you something to eat." As she prepared a simple meal, James talked continuously of his prospects, of the fortunes being made by men no smarter than himself, of how close he'd come in Utah before a cave-in destroyed 3 months of work. Elizabeth listened without comment, noting how he never asked about her life during the many months of his absence, how he seemed to consider her existence here in Georgetown as merely pause during his adventures, ready to resume at his convenience. They ate in what passed for companionable silence, though the quiet felt strained to Elizabeth in a way it never had with Matthew. After the meal, James produced a small pouch containing a few dollars, far less than Elizabeth would need to maintain herself for the coming months. "It's all I can spare right now," he said apologetically. "But Telluride's going to change everything. You'll see." Elizabeth accepted the money without argument, having long since learned the futility of confronting James about financial matters. "I've been thinking of opening a dress shop," she said instead. Mrs. Daniels mentioned the space next to the mercantile is available for reasonable rent. James frowned. A shop? That's no occupation for my wife. What would people think? They might think I'm using my God-given talents to support myself while my husband seeks his fortune. Elizabeth replied with more sharpness than she intended. James's frown deepened. You've changed, Lizzie. There's a hardness to you that wasn't there before. Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. Loss changes a person, James, as does being left to face it alone. A flash of guilt crossed his features before being replaced by defensive indignation. I'm doing all this for us, you know, for our future. Are you? Elizabeth asked quietly. Or are you doing it for the thrill of the search? For that moment of possibility before disappointment sets in again, James stood abruptly. I don't have to justify myself to you. I'm your husband, and I'm doing what a man needs to do to provide. Except you're not providing, James. I'm surviving on my sewing and the kindness of neighbors who bring extra when they can spare it. The truth hung between them like a physical presence. James looked away first, running a hand through his disheveled hair. It'll be different after Telluride, I promise. Elizabeth had heard this promise too many times to count. She simply nodded, too tired to argue further. You'll want to bathe before bed. I'll heat water. That night, lying beside her husband for the first time in nearly a year, Elizabeth felt a profound disconnect. His body next to hers was familiar yet strange. His breathing pattern in sleep as recognizable as her own heartbeat, yet somehow foreign. She stared at the ceiling, thinking of Rose's grave on the hillside, of Matthew's gentle presence beside her there, of the letters stored carefully in her dresser drawer that had sustained her through winter's darkest days. James was gone by mid-morning the following day, his farewells as perfunctory as his arrival had been unexpected. He promised to write, to send money when he could, to return with news of success that would change their fortunes. Elizabeth nodded and accepted his quick kiss, with the practiced patience of a woman accustomed to being left behind. As his figure disappeared down the road toward the stagecoach office, Elizabeth felt neither sadness nor relief, only a strange sense of clarity. The man riding away was her husband by law and covenant, but he had become a stranger in all the ways that mattered. He hadn't asked about Rose beyond that first callous comment. He hadn't inquired about Elizabeth's grief or recovery. He hadn't truly seen her at all. She returned to her house and, with deliberate movements, packed away the cradle that had stood empty in the corner since Rose's birth. The action wasn't an abandonment of her daughter's memory, but rather an acknowledgement that life continued despite loss. Rose would always be part of her, but perhaps it was time to stop letting grief define her existence entirely. That afternoon, Elizabeth walked to the mercantile and inquired about the vacant space beside it. Mr. Thompson, the proprietor, seemed surprised but not disapproving of her interest in establishing a dress shop. "Seems a sensible venture to me, Mrs. Vaughn," he said, showing her the modest but well-lit room. "Town's growing, and the ladies are always looking for finer things than my store can stock. Your work with a needle is well known." By the time she left, Elizabeth had negotiated a reasonable rent and promised to give her final decision within the week. The prospect both terrified and exhilarated her a step toward independence she had never quite dared to take before. That evening, she wrote to Matthew, describing James's brief visit and her tentative plans for the shop. She found herself being more honest with him than she had been with anyone in years, expressing both her frustration with James's continued absence and her own guilt at feeling relieved by it. The letter was perhaps more revealing than propriety would allow, but Elizabeth found she couldn't maintain pretenses with the one person who had truly seen her grief and stood beside her through it. Matthew's response came faster than usual, suggesting he had expedited his reply through private courier rather than waiting for the regular stagecoach mail. His words were careful but clear. He supported her dress shop ambitions wholeheartedly, believed she had both the skill and determination to succeed, and offered to help with the initial investment if she would accept it as a business arrangement rather than charity. Regarding James, Matthew wrote with surprising grace, "I cannot judge another man's choices, especially one facing the harsh realities of mining life. But I can say with certainty that were I fortunate enough to have a wife of your character and intelligence, no silver strike, however promising, would keep me from her side for long." The words warmed Elizabeth even as they complicated her already conflicted feelings. There was a rightness to her connection with Matthew that she couldn't deny, yet she remained bound by vows to a man who seemed increasingly a phantom in her life. Spring progressed into early summer, bringing with it the opening of Elizabeth's dress shop, a modest establishment she named Rose Needlework, in quiet tribute to her daughter. The women of Georgetown responded enthusiastically to having a skilled seamstress and dressmaker permanently established in town, and Elizabeth found herself with more commissions than she could reasonably complete alone. By July, she had hired a young widow named Clara to assist with basic stitching, allowing Elizabeth to focus on design and more complex work. The arrangement benefited them. Both Clara needed the income after her husband's death in a mining accident, and Elizabeth welcomed both the help and the companionship during working hours. Matthew continued to write regularly, though business had prevented him from returning to Georgetown. His letters described a particularly busy breeding season, with several of his mares producing exceptional foals that promised to enhance his reputation further. He wrote of expansion plans for his ranch, of negotiations with army purchasers interested in his stock, of the satisfaction he found in work that allowed him to build something lasting. Elizabeth found herself sharing her own small triumphs, a particularly challenging gown completed for Mrs. Sutton's trip to Denver, the satisfaction of her first month showing a modest profit, the pleasure of creating beautiful things that brought joy to others. She didn't explicitly mention the growing independence her business provided, but it was evident in the confidence that infused her writing. James's letters, by contrast, grew increasingly infrequent and brief. The Telluride venture had proven disappointing, sending him further south into the San Juan Mountains, where new strikes were reported weekly. His financial contributions remained minimal and sporadic, though his letters never failed to mention how the next claim would surely be the one to change everything. As autumn approached, Elizabeth found herself at a crossroads she hadn't anticipated. Her business was thriving beyond her initial expectations. Her grief for Rose had evolved into a more manageable sorrow, one that allowed her to function and even find moments of joy. Her friendship with Matthew, conducted entirely through letters since his spring visit, had deepened into something she could no longer pretend was merely platonic, though neither of them had crossed the line into explicit declarations. And James remained absent physically, emotionally, practically from her life. The decision crystallized one September evening as Elizabeth sat alone in her small house, reading Matthew's latest letter by lamplight. He wrote of an upcoming cattle sale that would bring him to Denver in October, mentioning that such business could reasonably extend to Georgetown if she thought it appropriate for him to visit. The carefully phrased question acknowledged the complications of their situation while still expressing his desire to see her again. Elizabeth set the letter aside and stared into the fire, weighing obligation against reality, duty against truth by morning. she had made her decision. She would invite Matthew to Georgetown. She would see him face to face and determine if what had grown between them through their correspondence was real or merely a product of mutual grief and isolation. And then, regardless of the outcome, she would take steps to formally end her marriage to James, a man who had effectively abandoned her in all but name. The decision brought both anxiety and a surprising sense of peace. Elizabeth had spent years being the dutiful wife, waiting patiently for a husband whose dreams never seemed to include her. Rose's death had shown her the fragility of life and the importance of living honestly. Whatever happened with Matthew, she couldn't continue in a marriage that existed only on paper. Elizabeth wrote 2 letters that day. The first to Matthew, extending an invitation to visit Georgetown during his October business trip, her words careful but warm with anticipation. The second to James, sent to the last address he had provided, informing him of her intention to seek a divorce on grounds of abandonment, and requesting that he return to Georgetown to discuss the matter if he wished to contest it. Both letters posted, Elizabeth turned her attention to her growing business. The approach of winter meant increased orders for warmer clothing, and the upcoming holiday season promised to be busy for Rose needlework. She threw herself into her work, finding solace in the rhythm of needle and thread, in the satisfaction of creation, in the simple human connections formed with customers and with Clara, whose friendship had become increasingly important. Matthew's reply arrived within the week, confirming his planned visit in mid-October. His words were measured but couldn't entirely conceal his eagerness to see her again. He mentioned bringing a selection of finer fabrics from Denver that might interest her for her more affluent clients, a thoughtful consideration of her business needs alongside his personal desire to see her. No response came from James, though Elizabeth hadn't truly expected one. His pattern of sporadic communication made it likely her letter was sitting unclaimed at some remote mining camp post office, or that James had already moved on to another location in his endless pursuit of elusive wealth. As October progressed, and the first snow dusted the highest peaks surrounding Georgetown, Elizabeth found herself simultaneously dreading and anticipating Matthew's visit. The dress shop provided welcome distraction during daylight hours, but evenings alone in her house left too much time for contemplation of what might come next. Matthew arrived on a crisp afternoon when the aspens had reached their golden peak, the mountains a breathtaking backdrop of autumn splendor. Elizabeth was completing a fitting with Mrs. Thompson when the shop door opened, bringing with it a gust of cool air, and the man whose letters had sustained her for nearly a year. Their eyes met across the room, and Elizabeth felt a jolt of recognition that went beyond mere familiarity. Matthew stood quietly by the door, hat in hand, waiting patiently while she finished with her customer. His consideration in not interrupting her business only endeared him to her further. When Mrs. Thompson finally departed, promising to return the following week for her completed dress, Matthew and Elizabeth found themselves alone in the shop, the counter between them like a symbolic barrier neither was quite ready to cross. "Elizabeth," Matthew said, his voice warm with pleasure. "Your shop is everything you described and more." "Matthew," she replied, a smile spreading across her face despite her nervousness, "it's so good to see you." The formality between them lasted only moments before Matthew moved around the counter and took her hands in his. The touch was proper, nothing more than a greeting between friends, but the current that passed between them was unmistakable. "You look well," he said, his eyes taking in the healthy color in her cheeks, the confidence in her posture that had been absent during his previous visit. "As do you," Elizabeth responded, noting the sun-bronzed quality of his skin from months of outdoor work, the relaxed set of his shoulders that spoke of a man comfortable with himself and his place in the world. Their initial awkwardness faded quickly, as Matthew produced a package containing the promised fabric's fine wools and silks unavailable in Georgetown's limited mercantile. Elizabeth exclaimed over them with genuine delight, her designer's mind already envisioning the elegant garments they could become. "These are exquisite, Matthew. My customers will be thrilled, especially with the holidays approaching." His pleasure at her reaction was evident. "I thought they might be useful. The merchant in Denver owed me a favor after I found him a particularly fine carriage horse." Their conversation flowed easily as Elizabeth closed the shop for the day. Matthew spoke of his journey, of Denver's continued growth, of the success of his breeding program. Elizabeth told him of her expanding business, of Clara's invaluable assistance, of her growing confidence in her own abilities. "Would you care to join me for dinner at the hotel restaurant?" Matthew asked as they stepped outside. "Or would that be?" He hesitated, clearly mindful of her reputation. Elizabeth smiled, appreciating his consideration but past caring about small-town gossip. "I would be delighted to join you for dinner, Matthew, but perhaps we might visit Rose first." His expression softened. "Of course." They walked to the cemetery together, the late afternoon sun gilding the autumn landscape. At Rose's grave, now marked with a small stone Elizabeth had commissioned from her shop's first profits, they stood in companionable silence. Matthew's presence beside her felt right in a way Elizabeth couldn't fully articulate, a shared understanding that required no words. After a moment, he reached for her hand, and she gave it willingly. "She would be proud of you," Matthew said quietly. "Of your strength, your resilience." Elizabeth felt tears well in her eyes. "I think of her every day, not just with sadness anymore, but wondering who she might have become." Matthew nodded. "That's how remembrance should be, I think, honoring what might have been while still embracing what is." As they turned to leave, Elizabeth kept her hand in his, drawing comfort from the connection. The gesture felt both bold and entirely natural. Dinner at the hotel restaurant was a relaxed affair, despite the curious glances from other patrons. Georgetown was small enough that Elizabeth's status, as a married woman, dining with a man not her husband, would certainly generate gossip. Yet seated across from Matthew, sharing a meal and conversation that flowed effortlessly from serious topics to light-hearted observations, Elizabeth found she couldn't bring herself to care about appearances. As their meal concluded, Matthew hesitated before speaking. "I've taken a room here for 2 nights," he said, his tone carefully neutral. "I have business with Mr. Sutton tomorrow regarding some horses, but I had hoped we might spend some time together if your schedule allows." "The shop can manage without me for a day," Elizabeth replied. "Clara is quite capable of handling basic fittings and sales." Matthew's smile lit his eyes. "Then perhaps you might show me more of Georgetown tomorrow. I've seen little beyond the main street and the trail to the Silver Strike." "I would enjoy that," Elizabeth said, meaning it sincerely. He walked her home afterward, their pace unhurried despite the growing chill as night descended. At her gate, Matthew paused, clearly torn between propriety and desire. "Elizabeth," he began, then stopped, searching for words. She saved him the struggle. "I wrote to James," she said quietly. "About seeking a divorce." Matthew's expression registered surprise, then concern. "Are you certain that's what you want?" The question confirmed what Elizabeth already knew about his character, that he would put her well-being above his own desires, that he would never press her toward a decision that might bring her regret. "I am," she said firmly. "My marriage exists on paper only, Matthew." James made his choice long ago when he placed silver dreams above our life together. Rose's death only made the emptiness between us more apparent. Matthew nodded slowly. And if he contests it, he won't, Elizabeth said with certainty born of years of understanding her husband's priorities. A divorce would free him as much as it would me. They stood in silence for a moment, the implications of her statement hanging in the air between them. Finally, Matthew spoke, his voice low but clear. "I won't pretend I'm not glad to hear it, Elizabeth. But I want you to be sure this decision is for you, not for any potential future with me." Elizabeth met his gaze steadily. "It's for me. For the woman I've become this past year, a woman who values herself enough to seek honesty in all aspects of her life." Matthew's expression softened. "Then I respect your decision, and I'll support you through it however you need." He took her hand and raised it to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture both old-fashioned and deeply intimate. "Good night, Elizabeth." "Good night, Matthew," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. She watched him walk back toward the hotel, his tall figure outlined against the night sky, before entering her house. For the first time in years, Elizabeth felt truly at peace with her path forward, whatever it might hold. The following day brought clear skies and unseasonably mild temperatures, perfect weather for showing Matthew the Georgetown beyond its main thoroughfare. They visited the small library where Elizabeth often borrowed books during long winter evenings, the scenic overlook that provided sweeping views of the valley, and finally, a secluded spot along the creek where aspen leaves carpeted the ground in gold. Their conversation ranged widely, from childhood memories to future aspirations, from favorite books to philosophical questions about life's purpose and meaning. Elizabeth found herself sharing thoughts she had never voiced aloud to anyone, not even to James in the early days of their marriage when communication between them had been more open. "I want to expand the shop eventually," she confided as they sat on a fallen log beside the creek. "Perhaps add millinery or even ready-made garments for those who can't afford custom work. There's a need in mining communities for practical women's clothing that still allows for some beauty and individuality." Matthew nodded, his expression thoughtful. "You have a gift for seeing possibilities others miss. It's one of the things I admire most about you." Elizabeth smiled, warmed by his understanding. "What about you? Will you remain in Denver, or does your ranch keep you too isolated?" "The isolation suited me after Margaret died," Matthew admitted. "I needed the space to grieve without constant reminders or well-meaning interference. But lately—" he glanced at her, his meaning clear. "Lately, I've been considering the benefits of being closer to town." The implication hung between them, neither pushing for declarations that would be premature while Elizabeth's marriage still legally existed, yet both acknowledging the direction their hearts were leading them. As afternoon yielded to evening, they made their way back toward town, walking close enough that their hands occasionally brushed seemingly accidental touches that sent awareness coursing through Elizabeth each time they occurred. "Would you join me for dinner again tonight?" Matthew asked as they approached the main street. Elizabeth nodded, then hesitated. "Actually, I thought perhaps I might cook for you at my home. Nothing elaborate, but—" The invitation crossed another line of propriety, yet Elizabeth found she didn't care. She was a grown woman making choices about her own life, not a girl needing protection from herself or others. Matthew's eyes held hers, giving her the opportunity to reconsider. When she didn't, he nodded. "I would like that very much." Dinner at Elizabeth's small house had an intimacy that transcended anything possible in the hotel restaurant. She prepared a simple but satisfying meal of roast chicken, potatoes, and early autumn vegetables, while Matthew built a fire in the hearth against the evening chill. They ate at her small table, conversation flowing as easily as it had in their letters, the comfort between them belying the relatively brief time they had spent in each other's physical presence. After the meal, they settled before the fire with cups of coffee, close enough that Elizabeth could feel the warmth of Matthew's presence alongside the heat of the flames. In this moment of quiet companionship, she found herself studying his profile, the strong line of his jaw, the slight crinkles at the corners of his eyes that spoke of both laughter and hardship, the way firelight played across features that had become dear to her through months of correspondence. As if sensing her gaze, Matthew turned toward her. "What are you thinking?" he asked softly. Elizabeth considered deflecting with a light response but found herself answering with honesty instead. "That I'm grateful you were at the cemetery that day. That somehow, in the midst of my greatest sorrow, I found an unexpected connection that has sustained me through this year." Matthew's expression was tender as he set his cup aside and took her hand in both of his. "I believe some souls recognize each other, Elizabeth, beyond reason or explanation." "Like yours recognized Margaret's?" she asked, voicing the question that had lingered despite her growing feelings for him. Matthew nodded slowly. "Yes, and like mine recognized yours even in grief. Perhaps especially in grief, when we're stripped of pretense and standing most honestly as ourselves." The simple truth of his words touched Elizabeth deeply. "I worried sometimes in your letters that I was merely a replacement for what you lost." "Never," Matthew said firmly. "What I feel for you is entirely its own, different from what I shared with Margaret, but no less real for being different." Elizabeth nodded, understanding completely. Her feelings for Matthew existed independently of her history with James, neither diminishing nor being diminished by that earlier chapter of her life. Matthew's thumbs traced gentle circles on her palms as he continued. "I want you to know that whatever happens with your divorce proceedings, whether they go smoothly or face complications, my regard for you won't change. I can be as patient as necessary." The tenderness of this assurance brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes. "Thank you for that. But I believe James will accept the dissolution of our marriage with minimal resistance. He's been seeking freedom for years, just not the courage to admit it." Matthew raised one hand to gently brush a strand of hair from her face, the gesture achingly intimate. "Then know that when you're ready, truly ready, I will be here." Elizabeth leaned into his touch, her heart full with emotions too complex for simple naming. "I already know that, Matthew. It's one of the many reasons I've come to love you." The words, spoken aloud for the first time, hung in the air between them. Matthew's expression transformed, hope and joy replacing careful restraint. "Elizabeth," he said, her name a prayer on his lips, "I have loved you since watching you grieve with such profound dignity. Since reading your thoughts in letters that revealed a mind and heart I could spend a lifetime discovering. Since seeing you rebuild your life with courage most would envy." The confession, long anticipated yet still overwhelming in its reality, drew Elizabeth toward him as inevitably as the tide is drawn to shore. When their lips met, it was with the gentleness of mutual reverence, of boundaries respected even as they were cautiously crossed. Matthew pulled back first, his forehead resting against hers. "I should go," he said reluctantly, "while I can still convince myself it's the right thing to do." Elizabeth nodded, appreciating his restraint even as part of her wished he would stay. They both knew that while her heart had made its choice, legal matters remained to be resolved before they could fully embrace a future together. At the door, Matthew kissed her once more, a promise rather than a goodbye. "I'll return in a month if that's agreeable," he said. "By then, Perhaps there will be news regarding your petition." "A month," Elizabeth agreed, already anticipating the letters that would bridge the separation. After Matthew's departure, Elizabeth moved through her evening routine with a strange mixture of contentment and anticipation. The confession of their mutual feelings had shifted something fundamental between them, making the path forward both clearer and more complex. The following weeks brought a flurry of legal proceedings, as Elizabeth formally filed for divorce on grounds of abandonment. The local judge, sympathetic to her situation after nearly 2 years without her husband's consistent presence or support, assured her that the case was straightforward, particularly given James's failure to respond to official notifications. Matthew's letters during this period were a balm to the stress of legal matters and town gossip. He wrote of his daily life on the ranch, of the winter preparations underway, of his hopes for their future, while never pressuring Elizabeth about timelines or decisions. His restraint and respect only deepened her certainty that her heart had chosen wisely. November brought early snow and increasing cold to the mountains, along with an unexpected letter from James. The response, arriving weeks after legal proceedings had begun, was brief and surprisingly amicable. He expressed regret for how things turned out and raised no objections to the divorce, asking only for his father's pocket watch and a few personal effects he had left behind. The letter concluded with an unexpected grace note. "You deserve happiness, Lizzie. I'm sorry I couldn't be the one to provide it." Elizabeth read the letter several times, finding in its simple acknowledgement a form of closure she hadn't realized she needed. James hadn't fought for their marriage, hadn't suddenly recognized what he was losing, hadn't made dramatic promises of change. Instead, he had accepted the truth they had both been avoiding for years, that their paths had diverged beyond reconciliation. She wrote to Matthew that evening, sharing James's response and her own feelings of relief and melancholy. Not sadness for the end of her marriage, which had effectively concluded long before legal proceedings began, but for the young woman she had been full of hope and romance, believing in happily ever after with a man whose dreams never included building a life together. Matthew's reply, arriving faster than usual thanks to a private courier, was characteristically thoughtful. "We all carry our pasts with us, Elizabeth. They shape who we become without defining who we must remain. Your capacity for love, despite disappointment, is testament to your extraordinary spirit." By early December, with the divorce proceedings moving smoothly toward conclusion, Matthew returned to Georgetown as promised. The reunion at Elizabeth's shop was more openly affectionate than previous meetings, though still mindful of propriety until legal matters were fully resolved. The judge expects to finalize everything before Christmas, Elizabeth told him as they walked toward her home after closing the shop. "He's been surprisingly understanding. Judge Halloran has a reputation for fairness," Matthew nodded, "and your situation is unfortunately common in mining communities." The knowledge that others had faced similar circumstances provided little comfort to Elizabeth, who had once believed her marriage would be different from the many mining town unions that dissolved under the strain of prolonged separation. Still, she was grateful for the judge's efficiency in handling her case. "I've been thinking," Matthew said as they reached her gate, "about the future, our future, if you'll allow me to presume." Elizabeth smiled at his careful phrasing. "I think we're past the point where such presumption is unwarranted." Matthew returned her smile before continuing more seriously. "My ranch outside Denver is doing well, as I've mentioned in my letters. But I've recently been offered an opportunity to establish a new breeding operation near Central City." Elizabeth's breath caught. Central City was less than 20 miles from Georgetown, a significant move closer than Denver. Are you considering it? I am, Matthew nodded. The property has excellent water rights and good grazing. The proximity to the mining operations means steady demand for quality horses. And he paused, meeting her eyes directly. It would place me near enough to Georgetown to be part of your daily life, while still allowing you to maintain your shop and the independence you've worked so hard to establish. The thoughtfulness of his consideration that he would adjust his business plans to accommodate her needs rather than expecting her to abandon her livelihood for him touched Elizabeth deeply. That sounds like a wonderful opportunity, she said, meaning it sincerely. For both of us. Matthew's expression grew more serious. Elizabeth, I know it's premature while your divorce is still pending, but I want you to know my intentions. When the time is right, when you're ready, I intend to ask you to be my wife. Not to replace what either of us has lost, but to build something new together. Elizabeth felt tears welling in her eyes even as joy expanded in her chest. I would welcome that question when the time comes, Matthew, and I think you already know my answer. His smile was radiant as he took her hand and raised it to his lips. Then we have much to look forward to. The weeks leading to Christmas passed in a blur of activity. Elizabeth's shop experienced its busiest season yet, with women throughout Georgetown seeking special garments for holiday gatherings. Matthew divided his time between finalizing arrangements for the Central City property and helping Elizabeth when her workload became overwhelming, proving himself adept at simple tasks like cutting patterns and even basic stitching that freed her for more complex work. On December 23rd, Judge Halloran signed the final decree dissolving Elizabeth's marriage to James Vaughn. The document arrived at her home that afternoon, delivered by the court clerk with congratulations that seemed strangely appropriate despite the somber nature of divorce. Elizabeth stood in her kitchen, reading the legal language that officially ended one chapter of her life and opened the possibility for another. She was still holding the document when a knock came at her door. Opening it revealed Matthew, his expression hopeful as he took in the paper in her hands. "It's done," she said simply, stepping back to invite him inside. Matthew closed the door behind him, then gently took the decree and set it aside before taking both her hands in his. "Are you all right?" he asked, his concern genuine. Elizabeth considered the question honestly. "Yes," she finally said. "I feel peaceful, relieved, ready." The last word hung between them, laden with meaning. Matthew's eyes searched hers, finding confirmation of what she was trying to convey. "I had planned to wait," he said quietly, "to give you time to adjust to this change in your circumstances. But if you're truly ready—" He released her hands only to reach into his pocket, producing a small wooden box that he opened to reveal a ring, a simple but elegant design featuring a small pearl surrounded by tiny sapphires that reminded Elizabeth of mountain forget-me-nots. "Elizabeth," Matthew said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his features. "This past year has taught me that life is too precious and too uncertain for hesitation when the heart is sure. I love you, your strength, your intelligence, your capacity for both grief and joy. I want to build a life with you, to support your dreams as you support mine, to face whatever comes with you by my side." He took a deep breath. "Will you marry me?" Tears blurred Elizabeth's vision as she nodded. "Yes, Matthew, yes." He slid the ring onto her finger, then drew her into an embrace that conveyed more than words ever could: tenderness and passion, promise and commitment, shared understanding of loss, and equal determination to embrace joy. Their kiss deepened, uninhibited now by legal or moral constraints. Elizabeth felt a liberation that went beyond the divorce decree, a freedom to love fully, to choose consciously, to build a future based on mutual respect rather than youthful fantasy. When they finally drew apart, Matthew rested his forehead against hers. "When?" he asked simply. Elizabeth considered. Social convention might suggest a longer period between divorce and remarriage, but at 31, with experiences that had aged her well beyond her years, she found herself unwilling to defer happiness for the sake of appearances. After the new year, she decided. A small ceremony, nothing elaborate. Matthew nodded, his smile reflecting her own certainty. "Whatever you wish, though I should warn you that Felipe is likely to insist on a proper celebration at the ranch once we're settled." The thought of beginning their marriage with community and joy rather than the isolation that had marked so much of her life with James appealed to Elizabeth. "I would like that." They spent that evening planning their future practical discussions of when Matthew would complete the purchase of the Central City property, how Elizabeth might expand her business to serve both communities, whether they would maintain her Georgetown house alongside the ranch home for convenience during busy seasons. Christmas Eve brought a surprise visit from Judge Halloran, who appeared at Elizabeth's door with his wife, both bearing small gifts and good wishes. "Mrs. Harrington and I thought you might appreciate some company this evening," the judge explained, using Elizabeth's maiden name with a kindness that acknowledged her return to her former identity. "Unless you already have plans." Elizabeth glanced at Matthew, who had been helping her prepare a simple holiday meal. "Actually, Judge Halloran, I'd like to introduce you to my fiancé, Matthew Parker." The judge's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained benevolent. "That was quick work, Mr. Parker," he said, extending his hand. "Not as quick as it might appear, Your Honor," Matthew replied respectfully. "Elizabeth and I have known each other for over a year." Mrs. Halloran, a practical woman with keen eyes that missed little, nodded approvingly. "Life is too short to waste time when you've found the right person. Now, shall we add our contributions to your table? I've brought my cranberry preserves that Joseph insists are required for any proper holiday meal." The unexpected guests transformed what would have been an intimate evening into a small celebration. Judge Halloran proved to be an engaging conversationalist away from his official capacity, sharing stories of early Georgetown before the silver boom transformed it from a small settlement to a thriving community. His wife, equally interesting, spoke of her work with the town's small school and her hopes for establishing a proper library in the coming year. As the evening progressed, Elizabeth found herself imagining future gatherings in their home, friends and neighbors sharing meals and conversation, children eventually adding their energy to the mix, a community of connection that had been largely absent during her years with James. The Hallorans departed shortly before midnight, leaving Elizabeth and Matthew alone once more. As they stood in the doorway watching the couple make their way through fresh snow toward their home further up the street, Matthew slipped his arm around Elizabeth's waist. "They're good people," he observed, "the kind who build communities rather than just residing in them." Elizabeth nodded, leaning against him. "I'd like our home to be like that, open to friends, welcoming to neighbors." "It will be," Matthew promised, pressing a kiss to her temple. "Everything we build will be together." The new year arrived with continued snowfall and temperatures that kept most of Georgetown's residents close to their hearths. Elizabeth and Matthew used the quiet period to finalize plans for their wedding, scheduled for January 15th. It would be a simple ceremony at Judge Halloran's home, with Clara and Felipe as witnesses, followed by a small reception at the hotel restaurant where they had shared their first meal together in Georgetown. Elizabeth created a special dress for the occasion, not white, which would have seemed inappropriate given her previous marriage, but a deep blue that complemented her eyes and the sapphires in her engagement ring. The design was elegant without being ostentatious, practical enough for the winter weather while still marking the day as special. Matthew divided his time between Georgetown and Central City, overseeing renovations to the ranch house while returning every few days to be with Elizabeth. Their separations, though brief, only reinforced their appreciation for each other's company when reunited. On the evening before their wedding, Matthew brought Elizabeth to the cemetery for a quiet moment at Rose's grave. The small stone marker was barely visible beneath fresh snow, but Matthew carefully cleared it, revealing the simple inscription, "Rose Vaughn, beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." They stood together in the fading January light, Elizabeth drawing strength from Matthew's presence beside her. "I want her to be part of tomorrow," she said softly. "Part of our family, even though she's not here with us." Matthew nodded, understanding without need for further explanation. "She is and always will be. Just as Margaret and my son are part of who I am, Rose is part of who you are and therefore part of us." The acknowledgement brought tears to Elizabeth's eyes, not of grief this time, but of gratitude for this man who embraced all aspects of her life, past and present. "I never imagined, that day you found me here, that we would end up where we are now," she said, her voice quiet but steady. Matthew took her hand, his touch warm despite the winter chill. "Some journeys can't be imagined until we're on them, but I'm grateful for every step that led us here." They lingered a few minutes longer before making their way back toward town, the lights of Georgetown glowing warmly against the gathering darkness. At Elizabeth's gate, Matthew kissed her with gentle passion before reluctantly pulling away. "Until tomorrow," he said, the simple farewell carrying the weight of promise. Elizabeth watched him walk toward the hotel, her heart full with anticipation for the life they would begin together the following day. The wedding ceremony itself was brief, but meaningful. Judge Halloran officiating with genuine warmth as Matthew and Elizabeth exchanged vows they had written themselves. Elizabeth promised to support Matthew's dreams as he supported hers, to build a home filled with honesty and respect, to face life's sorrows and joys with equal courage. Matthew vowed to cherish Elizabeth's strength and independence alongside her tenderness, to nurture their love through all seasons of life, to create together what neither could alone. As they exchanged rings, Matthew's a simple gold band that matched the setting of Elizabeth's pearl and sapphire, Elizabeth felt a sense of rightness that transcended the ceremony itself. This wasn't the romanticized union of her youth, built on fantasy and fleeting passion, but a conscious joining of two people who had experienced life's harshest realities and still chosen love. The small reception that followed was filled with warmth and genuine goodwill from the few guests in attendance. Clara and Mrs. Daniels from the restaurant had collaborated on a beautiful cake. Felipe, Matthew's ranch hand who had traveled from Denver for the occasion, presented them with a handcrafted leather album for photographs of their future together. Judge and Mrs. Halloran offered a crystal vase that had been in their family for generations, symbolizing both fragility and endurance. As the celebration wound down in late afternoon, Elizabeth and Matthew thanked their guests and prepared to depart for the ranch house in Central City, which would be their primary residence while maintaining Elizabeth's Georgetown home for the days when shop business required her presence in town. The journey through snow-covered mountain roads took longer than usual, but by early evening they arrived at the property that would become their home. The ranch house was modest but well built, with recent renovations that reflected Matthew's practical nature and attention to detail. A fire had been laid in the hearth, ready for lighting, and provisions stocked in the kitchen Felipe's work before he departed for Denver after the wedding. Matthew carried Elizabeth across the threshold, an old tradition that made them both laugh with the simple joy of being together. Setting her gently on her feet in the main room, he lit the fire while Elizabeth explored what would become their shared space. The house reflected Matthew's personality, functional without being austere, comfortable without being cluttered. Bookshelves lined one wall of the main room, already containing volumes from both their collections. The kitchen was well equipped for Elizabeth's enjoyment of cooking. The bedrooms, a master suite, and two smaller rooms held promise for both immediate comfort and future possibilities. "What do you think?" Matthew asked as he joined her by the large window overlooking what would be Pastureland in spring, now blanketed in pristine snow. "It's perfect," Elizabeth said honestly, turning to face the man who was now her husband. "It feels like a place where we can build a life." Matthew's smile was tender as he drew her into his arms. "That's exactly what we'll do, Elizabeth, day by day, year by year." Their kiss deepened, unhurried and filled with promise. The journey that had begun at a cemetery in shared grief now continued in a home built for shared joy, not erasing what came before, but creating something new from the foundations of experience and conscious choice. Later, as moonlight spilled through the bedroom window, Elizabeth rested her head on Matthew's chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. His fingers traced gentle patterns along her spine, their intimacy a natural extension of the emotional connection they had built over months of correspondence and meaningful conversation. "I love you, Elizabeth Parker," Matthew murmured against her hair, the new name an acknowledgement of their official union. "And I love you," she replied, raising herself on one elbow to look into his eyes. "For the man you are, for the man you'll become, for all the days we'll share." Their life together unfolded in the years that followed, with both expected joys and unforeseen challenges. The dress shop in Georgetown flourished under Clara's day-to-day management, with Elizabeth traveling there 3 days a week while developing a smaller satellite location in Central City that catered to the wives of mine owners and businessmen. Matthew's horse breeding operation gained reputation throughout Colorado territory, with Army contracts and private sales to ranches as far away as Wyoming and Montana. His fair business practices and quality stock made the Parker name synonymous with reliability and value. Their home became exactly what Elizabeth had envisioned, a welcoming place where friends and neighbors gathered regularly, where laughter and honest conversation flowed equally. Judge and Mrs. Halloran became particular friends, visiting often from Georgetown and bringing news of the community Elizabeth still considered partly hers. In the spring of 1878, just over a year after their marriage, Elizabeth discovered she was expecting a child. The joy of this news was tempered by natural anxiety given her previous loss, but Matthew's steady support and the care of a skilled physician in Denver helped allay her fears. That November, Elizabeth gave birth to a healthy son they named Thomas James Parker Thomas for Matthew's father, James in acknowledgement of the past that had shaped Elizabeth's journey to the present. Unlike Rose, Thomas entered the world robust and crying, his tiny fists waving in protest at the sudden cold after the warmth of his mother's womb. Holding her son in the early hours after his birth, with Matthew sitting beside them on the bed, his face alight with wonder and love, Elizabeth felt a completion of a circle begun that day at Rose's grave. The grief that had connected them initially had transformed into a love that now created new life, not replacing what was lost, but adding to the tapestry of their shared experience. "He's perfect," Matthew whispered, gently touching Thomas's tiny hand, which instinctively curled around his father's finger. "He is," Elizabeth agreed, tears of joy mingling with remembrance of the daughter who would always be her firstborn. "Rose is watching over her brother, I think." Matthew nodded, understanding without need for explanation. "Two mothers watching over him, Margaret, from wherever souls go when they leave us, and you right here, giving him life and love." The observation was so perfectly aligned with Elizabeth's own thoughts that she leaned over to kiss Matthew. Their son cradled between them, a physical manifestation of the love that had grown from shared grief into something beautiful and enduring. Thomas thrived, growing into a curious, energetic boy with his father's thoughtful nature and his mother's creativity. When he was 3, he gained a sister, Catherine Rose, named for both Matthew's mother and Elizabeth's firstborn. Unlike her brother's dramatic entry into the world, Catherine arrived quickly and quietly, as if eager to join their family with minimum disruption. As their children grew, Elizabeth and Matthew made regular visits to the Georgetown cemetery, placing flowers on Rose's grave and telling Thomas and Catherine about the sister who had come before them. These visits were never somber occasions, but rather family pilgrimages that honored the past while celebrating the present. "Rose helped bring your mama and me together," Matthew explained to 5-year-old Thomas one spring day as they stood by the small grave. "Sometimes the saddest things can lead to the most beautiful beginnings." Elizabeth, holding Catherine's hand beside him, felt the truth of his words resonate through her entire being. The stillborn daughter she had grieved alone, until a compassionate cowboy had knelt beside her in shared understanding, had been the catalyst for a life richer and more fulfilling than she could have imagined in those dark days of loss. By 1885, the Parker Ranch had expanded considerably, and Elizabeth's dress business had grown to include a successful mail-order component serving remote homesteads and ranches throughout Colorado Territory. Their partnership in business as in life demonstrated the strength that came from supporting each other's dreams while building shared ones. On a warm evening that summer, as they sat on the porch watching Thomas and Catherine play in the yard with their newest addition, a puppy Thomas had named Star for the white marking on his forehead, Matthew reached for Elizabeth's hand. "Are you happy?" he asked, the question simple but profound. Elizabeth looked at their children, at the home they had built together, at the man beside her who had grieved with her at her lowest moment and celebrated with her at her highest. "Completely," she answered honestly. "Beyond anything I could have hoped for." Matthew squeezed her hand, his eyes reflecting the sunset's golden light. "When I found you at that cemetery, I was only thinking of offering comfort to someone who knew the pain I'd experienced. I never imagined we would create all this from that moment of shared grief." Elizabeth leaned against his shoulder, watching their children's joyful play. "That's the miracle of it, isn't it? That life continues, that love grows, that beauty emerges from even our deepest sorrows." "That's exactly it," Matthew agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "And I'm grateful for every moment of this journey with you, past, present, and all the days to come." As twilight gathered around them and their children's laughter echoed across the yard, Elizabeth Parker knew with absolute certainty that the greatest love stories weren't those that avoided pain or pretended perfection, but those that acknowledged life's deepest sorrows while still choosing joy, day after day, year after year, a choice she and Matthew would continue to make together for all their remaining days.